Are we truly tired of Souls-like games, or is it just a lack of originality from many developers? And the reason why I ask this question is because recently the term fatigue has been thrown around quite loosely, and it's becoming more of a trending topic, and it's starting to lose a lot of its luster or meaning. And the reason why I bring this up is because every genre, from what I can remember over the last several years, maybe decades of the gaming industry, many genres have suffered from this form of what we call fatigue, whether it's the action adventure genre, the likes of God of War and Devil May Cry and Bayonetta and Ninja Gaiden. In the 2000s, that whole genre was oversaturated. Then we have the market of first-person shooters with your Call of Duties and your Battlefields, and now you got hero shooters and your Battle Royales. And that market at some point was known as fatigue. So is it really fatigue, or is it more so the fact that developers are not willing to take full advantage of being original? And by that, I'm not talking about trying to reinvent the wheel, because clearly the Souls genre, the Souls-like genre, is very popular. And that's why the industry is taking full advantage of it, because I think that the genre itself is very fun. I, for one, am a huge fan of Souls-like games because, unlike other more traditional action games where everything is pretty much set in stone, it's very linear in the sense that you get to point A to point B, it's very fast, it's quick, you press a few buttons, all these visuals happen on screen, boom, you beat the boss. But in the case of Souls-likes, the reason why they're so good is because they really credit the player for taking the time to explore the world, for taking the time to develop enough endurance and patience, and oftentimes sacrifice to beat bosses. But more so, I think it's the benefit of being able to recognize that one isn't strong enough, and so the game encourages players to go outside of that realm, explore the world, and then come back to that very same boss that was giving them trouble, and then ultimately defeating them. Whereas in other games, if you get stuck at a boss, you're kind of stuck there for a while. But in Souls-likes, if you're stuck at one area, you're more than welcome to just go off on your own, get more tools you need, come back, and then rinse and repeat. And to me, I think that's a beautiful thing about Souls-like games, is there's a sense of freedom that you get. And more specifically, the FromSoft games are really well known for that. And I think that formula has been admittedly copied over the years. And so this is where I feel the big issue is. I don't think it's so much that players are fatigued. I think it's that players want something fresh. And that's because every time a trailer is released, we see the same Souls-like tone. That is, we see the environment, we see the theme, the narrative, all tying into the very same theme that FromSoft typically tends to be associated with. The darker, more grittier tone of their design elements. And every time we see the same formula being rewritten, yes, from a visual perspective, players are going to be like, oh my gosh, another Souls-like game of the same recipe and formula. And so what I would prefer, or suggest rather, to more developers is to take a stance and to be more creative, in the sense that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's more or less a let's open doors to creativity, and let's take different elements. Let's create a new narrative. Let's create new environments that are fresh and satisfying to look at. For example, the likes of Wu Chang, right? The more recent Souls-like game that has come out. The reason why it has received a lot of positive feedback was because it was a fresh, intuitive game that took place in a different world, and it maintained that Souls-like formula, but it did so in a different way. That is, it introduced cool mechanics, it introduced a new environment for players to immerse themselves in, and more importantly, it introduced players to a culture that is oftentimes misunderstood, that being Chinese mythology and Chinese culture as a whole. So incorporating martial arts into the gameplay formula. Even games like Hollow Knight or Blasphemous, these games are examples of Souls-likes that retain that same great formula that makes these games so popular, but introduces a visual format that takes players away from the typical dark fantasy, gritty nature and introduces into something that's completely fresh. Another good example is Phantom Blade Zero, another upcoming Souls-like game, once again out of China. And that game has received a lot of positive feedback because of its fresh take on the genre. More martial arts, a new world for players to immerse themselves in, and less of that dark, gritty nature, and more of this colorful, lush, oftentimes very, again, Chinese mythology or Chinese cultured centered approach, which I think is really beautiful. So for me personally, I would like to see more original content coming out of the genre. Not so much there being fatigue, but it's more so, hey, developers, especially AAA companies too, because we've seen a lot of indie companies who have come out recently, and they've been trying their best to incorporate something new to the game in terms of the visual aesthetic and the gameplay loop and all those things. But I think the most important aspect for developers to take part in is to look at other themes, other tones. There's sci-fi that you can look into. There's a much more brighter fantasy. There's even just the sense of not just going for the super ultra realism, but using other different types of visuals, like go for maybe a cell shaded look, go for a more anime style look, like the likes of Code Vein or AI Limit. These are just examples of ways that companies can take initiative to continue to explore the Souls-like genre without it depriving itself of the joy and the experience that players should get from the game. Now, what do you folks think? Do you think it's a mixture of fatigue and a lack of originality, or do you think it's one or the other? Let me know in the comment section down below. And as always, me warriors, stay strong, keep fighting, and may the force be with you all, always. For more Souls-like content, action RPGs, and roguelikes, be sure to keep it locked here on the Nufrontier. Until then, take care.